and welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live video series. And joining me this week to share the stories behind the books which influenced him the most on his life journey is Dr. Richard Gold. Dr. Gold is a licensed acupuncturist and a Chinese medicine teacher who holds a doctorate in psychology and is one of the founders of the Pacific College of Oriental Medicine. He spent the last 4 decades pursuing mental mindfulness and meditative awareness, and in more recent years studying neuroscience and the evolving understanding of the effects of sound and meditation on the brain. He's written several books, and the best known one is Thai massage, a traditional medical technique. Dr. Richard Gold, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sandie. It's always lovely to see you.
You too, Richard. Let's start off by telling us what books mean to you and what this process was like for you.
Well, the process is the critical thing for me. I did my writing in the first month of quarantine. Who knew where it was going to take us? But we're over a year later now. And it really became a looking back of my path of, I am where I am now. And as a meditator, we want to stay in the moment, but clearly there was a trail. And this was allowed me to put the cookie crumbs out and look back and really see how influential certain readings were for me in my pursuits and my life choices. It was revealing, a little shocking, sometimes painful because it's not always been a smooth road, but ultimately filled with gratitude for where I am now. As I wrote in my introduction for this, books have always played a critical part of my life. I was from a family of readers. I even enjoyed the assignments in junior high of reading Silas Marner, and I loved Dickens, and I used to just love being in libraries. My grandmother was a library rat. I mean, she would read a book a day, it seemed like, and we would often pick up books for her and bring them to her. I even enjoyed going to the card catalog. I mean, that seems like an anachronism, certainly now, the Dewey Decimal System, and going through the card files and then traipsing through the library and hoping you'll find what you set out to do. So books have been extremely important to me. I still read all the time. And I can't imagine life without books.
How hard was it to pick 10 books?
Quite. I think I picked primarily at this crucial time in my life when things fell apart and then things started to come back together. I had a list and I was wondering, which would be most impactful, which would tell the best story for myself in terms of introspection at this point in my life. But there's so many that could have mentioned. I did resist going into your website and looking what other authors had offered, both to not get too many ideas and certainly not to repeat what people have already heard. But I really picked things in particular, and I think, as you noted in your little written introduction, some of my things are a little odd, I think, from a spiritual point of view. But as our listeners will hear, I've been a very practical person in many ways, and so some of my books are quite practical to my path and my work and my journey.
Well, it's interesting because obviously after about 6 months of doing these weekly interviews and about 60 plus contributions to the archive, the same books come up again and again, or at least a small number of the same books come up again and again. So I'm always tickled when I see something that is way out in left field, and it draws my attention, as we're going to find out a bit later with one of your books. So let's start with the first one, which was The Way of Zen by Alan Watts. And that particular book, which was published in 1957, has been mentioned as one of the most precious gifts of Asia to the world.
Yes. A little context, which is I was about a middle America as you want to be, born in 1950, eating white bread, drinking milk 3 times a day. I was from a very educated, intellectual, academic, liberal family, but we were pretty on the straight and narrow in many ways. And I actually, from the time I was 4, I wanted to be a doctor. So I went off to college as a pre-med chemistry major. And I was at a college called Oberlin College, which is a small liberal arts college in Ohio. But people who know about Oberlin know that it's quite reputable and has always had iconoclastic and out there sort of people. And just one day, a friend, not even a good friend, handed me the book, The Way of Zen, and said, I really think you should read this. I really want you to read this. And it was totally outside of the chemistry and biology and genetics and all those things I was studying. And I read this book and I felt like a puppy whose eyes started to open. I'd never been exposed to East Asian religious thought, meditative consciousness. None of those ideas had ever crossed my path. In addition, Watts is just a brilliant writer. As I've mentioned in my piece here, I actually had the chance to meet him. He was brought to Oberlin in my senior year, and his voice is just beautiful and eloquent. And he led some meditations. It was an early spring day in Northern Ohio, which is a bit of a miraculous moment. And it really cemented to me the impact of that, because it really, he touched me personally deeply. In this book really set me off in a direction I did not anticipate at all. Now, again, I was in college from 68 to 72 during the Vietnam War and the Cultural Revolution, the beginning of the women's movement, so many things that were in tumult. And this really set me up to be caught up on that wave and not cling to what was familiar and what I knew and what I depended on for my foundation. It definitely created not conflict so much, but challenges with everything that had come before, including parental relationships and things that were, what I had always done. And so I stopped being a pre-within. So I worked in the hospitals for 2 years during those first 2 years of college. By my third year of college, I became a religious studies major, and I totally dropped out of pre-med. What I saw in hospitals working as an orderly and direct patient care and like a nurse's assistant in many ways really spoiled me on the role model of medical doctors for myself. And those weren't the questions I was asking myself that I wanted to have answered at that time. And I really felt that more of a spiritual than really a religious path was where I was heading at that time. And there were enough cultural influences, I think, that I didn't feel too lonely. I saved the loneliness for a few books later on our discussion.
So did you actually get to speak to him?
Oh, I spent time with Alan Watts, and I was asked by the department to be his host. And at that time, the airport from Oberlin was about an hour drive into Cleveland. And so I went there, and we got there, and his flight was delayed. And so I didn't drive, there was a driver. So we sat in the back together. And he said, well, I have some extra time. You want to join me in the bar? Now, people who know about Alan Watts, that was a place you would often find him, would have been in the bar. And Oberlin was a dry town. You couldn't buy a beer there. There wasn't much drinking in my circles on campus at that time. And so after one screwdriver, my tongue was loose, and we were just two old friends talking. And he sort of, as I recall, he sort of interviewed me about what it's like to be a college student during the Vietnam War, during the cultural changes that were happening. So it was an absolute delight. And I treasure that moment. And subsequently, a number of years later, teaching at Esalen Institute, where he taught for a number of years himself, I actually taught in the Watts classroom, and I felt that connection really, really strongly. It was really wonderful moments.
So it must have been quite an iconic experience. The man who turned you on, so to speak.
Yes. And
there you are, sitting in a bar with him.
Yes. I didn't include Gary Snyder, the great Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, in my list, but I had a similar experience. I met him at Oberlin when he came to speak when I was first there, and then he was a good friend of my dissertation advisor here in San Diego, and I got to spend an evening in front of a fireplace with Gary Snyder, who's deeply into Zen Buddhism himself, and thankfully still living. He's quite an elderly gentleman now. And so absolutely, it really was synergy, and these synergistic meetings and sort of accidental, coincidental things, as you see, will play a continuing role in our discussion.
Yeah, well, and I think in all of our lives.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's just so many things are happening if we would just keep our eyes open and be in the moment
Yeah.
and not just be distracted by everything else.
So book number 2, The Teachings of Don Juan. This crops up a few times. A Yaqui Way of Knowledge by Carlos Castaneda.
Yeah. So one of the things that really began to continue to open my eyes was studying cultural anthropology. At that point, I had not been out of the U.S. I had traveled some in America, but not even that much. And all of a sudden, I'm reading this book and writing a paper about a shaman in training, which is very psychedelically influenced. And it was mind-blowing, and it really broke a lot of the structures of enculturation, which, once you step out of your enculturation and take a look, you realize how much you've been shaped by the culture, by the language, by your situation. And this book, it sort of gave me, we can talk about this openly now, especially in California, it gave me permission to explore psychedelics. And I didn't do it a lot. A little was plenty. No one talked about microdosing in those days. It really gave me permission to be experimental with my mind and consciousness and self. And again, it wasn't 100% roses and a scented path, but it was very mind opening and heart opening. And I felt one thing was like some of the boundaries or distancing we feel from others. There was a sense of like a heart melting with people I was close by to, and it was influential. Now then I wrote about it. Actually, I wrote about the way of Zen and the teachings of Don Juan from my anthropology professor, candidly. And I received, with no email there, of course, I received a personal note from him asking me to join him in his office because he was a little worried about me. And because, it was a time of change. And we talked, and he actually liked the paper and wasn't so worried about me, and was very supportive, not encouraging, but supportive. And coincidentally, again, I never met Carlos Castaneda, but he used to live in San Diego, where I live. And people in academics who knew him, I've met and said that he was certainly a very interesting man.
Where in San Diego?
And he was living in Ocean Beach area, that's where Jim Morrison of the Doors was living. And Ocean Beach was quite the cauldron of cultural events.
Wow. And I lived for 5 years in San Diego and I missed all that. Too late. So book number 3, Jesus of Nazareth by Gunther Bornkamm.
Bornkamm, yeah. A German scholar. So here I am, a religion major. Now again, so I grew up in a Reformed Jewish home, born in 1950, which really the Second World War was still permeating Jewish culture, besides all culture, I think, in the West. And so there was, it wasn't so much a fear, but there was an us and them in a sense with Christianity. I went to public schools. I was always around non-Jewish people. We went to a fully integrated high school. So it wasn't that I was just a naif in the woods per se, but I never explored Christianity. It was always the other, and I was afraid of the other. And with the opening that I was experienced from discussed, previous in our discussion, this course came up on the life and teachings of Christ, Jesus Christ. There was an academic course. It wasn't evangelical in any way. It was taught by a professor who became my mentor, who he was an archaeologist, and I went on archaeology with him in subsequent years. And I read this book, and the context of it and the non-preachingness of it was just, it really opened my heart to the teachings of Christ. And I recognized that this was one of the most elevated beings that's ever been on earth. And it really took a lot of fear away from me. And I felt much more able to be connected to a broader culture, because I mean, the Christian culture really is the culture I live in. I might be swimming in a little smaller bowl at that time in my life, but it made me much more comfortable in my own skin, in my own community, in my own neighbor, in my own country. And I felt that was quite a liberating moment. And it was a very well written book, quite academic. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily unless you're doing an academic study. German scholars are very particular. And but I found it a good read. And again, my teacher was an aspired lecturer, and he really helped elevate the experience for me. It was very, very positive.
Some of the books on your list, you know, they're quite unusual. I've never come across them before, and I'm curious to know how they fell into your hands or whether you sought them out. I mean, like book number 4, What the Buddha Taught. Wopala Rahula?
Rahula, yeah.
Yeah.
Both the Jesus of Nazareth and What the Buddha Taught were on curriculum. They were on reading list for my courses. What the Buddha Taught it's almost like starred points. You know, it's not a lot of literature at all. It's like, this is what the oldest Pali texts are teaching us. And right life, you know, the Eightfold Path, the 4 divine states of mind, you know, those specific things were just right there. And around that same time, I was introduced to meditation, which is at the crux of all this. And it just strongly resonated with me. And it was a reference that I could go back to and help clarify what it was. I've always felt from the beginning that I could be culturally Jewish and somewhat spiritually Jewish, and definitely embrace Buddhist teaching, because it's not for or against God or the concept of God. It's much more about the being and the connected of the being to self and self to community, or the Sangha, which is called in the Buddhist tradition. And that introduction and that comfort in Buddhism, and then not coincidentally, synergistically, at Oberlin College, when I was there, had introduced what they called winter term, which was the month of January between the fall and the spring terms, was an independent study month, that if you got one faculty member to approve what you wanted to look into, they would do it. They would sign you off and you could do anything. People took a road trip to California. People, you know, they did all sorts of things. My junior year, the religion department brought a Buddhist monk from Thailand to lead a month-long, what we would call Vipassana meditation. And we were in an underground space underneath what was called Asia House, which was the cultural dorm for East Asian studies. It was like being in a cave somewhere in the mountains somewhere. And we sat and did walking meditations, and he did Dharma talks. And it really was a very powerful experience. And the main thing I got from it was how difficult it is to meditate and how much of a monkey mind I have. And taming that monkey mind has been, for the next 50 years, has been what I've been after. And this book, actually, again, because the Dharma talks would go off in all these directions, and I would lose awareness, and my mind would start chattering, and my legs would hurt, and you know, the whole gamut we experience in long meditation programs, or even momentary ones. But it gave me a context and a not exactly a roadmap, but it gave me like a structure of thought that I could return to. And it's especially the Eightfold Path. I mean, if you're living on the Eightfold Path and your neighbors are too, you have community. You know, you're taking care of each other. You're doing unto others as you want to do unto you. And I've been very grateful in my life, as we'll talk about in a little bit, that my career is congruent with who I am and what I believe and what I hope to achieve in life. And these basic Buddhist teachings help set a nice foundation for me.
So at what point, was it after you graduated that you went off to Kentucky?
After I graduated.
After you graduated. So the next book, which is Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, translated by J. Legg, Where does that fit into the chronology here?
It was another text in my religious studies program. I did
Interesting.
a course that really stunned me was Chinese literature and translation, where the theories of the Tao Te Ching, basically of yin yang theory, permeate. I learned it permeated literature, it permeated architecture, it permeated agriculture. Subsequently, I learned it permeated medicine. And so this was just, and I had to include it because it's that, and it's been translated by hundreds of people. And you could read two translations next to each other, and the words are so different, but the spirit of it is still about this dynamic polarity of opposites, and how they need each other, they require each other. There's some of this and that, and some of that and this. And when that dynamic polarity ceases to exist, that's when life itself ceases to exist. So we need the dynamics of opposites to have the spark of life. And this book was just very comforting, and it read like poetry for me. I mean, I didn't know if I really understood it, per se, but the feeling of it felt just so congruent for me that I had to include it here in our list.
So the next one was Mystics and Zen Masters by Thomas Merton.
Again, an academic book that
curriculum.
Was curriculum. I tell you, Oberlin was an unusual place.
Sounds it.
Thomas Merton, many people know about him. Many people don't know about him. He's been dead since 1968. He wrote many, many books. This was one that was on the reading list, and it really struck me, and I read it wholeheartedly. Basically, that he was the first. Well, let me go back. Merton was an anti-war protester in the Second World War. He was a bon vivant. He was a man about town. He lived in Europe. He was living in New York City. One day he decided to become a Trappist silent monk, a Catholic monk. He wasn't raised Catholic. He wrote about this in a book called The Seven-Story Mountain, an autobiographical book. So he goes from a life of high culture and academics to becoming a silent monk on 1,000 acres of rural Kentucky, which plays into my story here. What this book is that he felt, because he was the first Westerner that developed, a spiritual Westerner that developed a relationship with D.T. Suzuki, who brought Zen Buddhism to the West in many ways. At least he wrote, there might have been others. And they had a dialogue. And even though he was living as a hermit, he also had correspondence. That really at the highest level of consciousness, all the structures of religious organizations melt away. And there's a unifying principle in the mystic realm. And that really appealed to me, because I was straddling different religious traditions myself, and instead of feeling fractured by that, there was a sense of wholeness now. And so Merton, he wrote many books. One of his last books was his journals of traveling to Asia. So he was well known in higher spiritual circles. He had a correspondence with the Dalai Lama, with Mahatma Gandhi. He finally got permission from his abbot at his monastery to leave the monastery to go to a world religion conference in Thailand, in Bangkok. And on the way, he met personally with the Dalai Lama. He gets to Bangkok, and this is a bit of a mystery what happened, although they think that what happened was he was in a bath, and an electric fan was blowing. I guess there wasn't air conditioning, and somehow he pulled the wire, the electric fan fell into the tub, and he was electrocuted to death.
Wow.
And that ended his life. He was still quite a young man. He had so much more to offer. And I mean, I just get emotional thinking about that. Another unusual coincidence, totally unplanned, is the first time I stepped off an airplane in Bangkok in Thailand, my trip, was the anniversary of Merton's death.
So you kind of followed in his footsteps, because you went to
Luckily,
Thailand, you went to China.
Yeah, and so I'll get into this. So I was in a seminar on Merton in the spring of '71. At that time, the Back to the Land movement was gaining interest in college campuses and in my community there. And an ad appeared in the Oberlin College newspaper, Land Beautiful, looking for college graduates who want to homestay. It was a very simple ad. I don't remember the exact wording. So my best friend was a year older than me, and he was getting married that spring. He really wanted to know what was next because the draft was just ending. So he was free from the draft. So we piled into a van and drove from Oberlin to what's called Hart County, Kentucky. It's near the Mammoth Caves National Park, which is the biggest cave system in the world, if anyone needs a landmark. Gorgeous part of the country. We walked into the apartment of the man who had put the ad, who was our host. He had a bookshelf of the complete collection of Merton's books on his shelf. And I just presented my paper in my seminar about Merton, and especially Mystics and Zen Master, sort of a personal experience with that. I was like, oh my gosh. And then it turns out Gethsemane Abbey was about 40 minutes from where we were sitting, where Merton had lived his life. So as we drove around this beautiful area looking at backwoods land to possibly purchase, Charlie, he said, you guys want to go just see where, because I expressed my interest in Merton. He said, you want to go see Gethsemane? So we said, sure. So we drove, and then we just stood outside the beautiful gates, but could see the country around there. Just so beautiful and conducive to like connecting to earth and spirit. On the way back at sunset, he said, there's one more farm I want to show, piece of land. It's not a farm, piece of land I want to show you. And at sunset, we walked up a wooded path through a mature hardwood forest and then limestone bluffs with red cedar growing on them, just a beautiful setting. And at sunset, we entered an open field, and I had this feeling of, I've arrived. And that's the land we bought. 120 acres of hardwood forest for $6,000. No running water, no electricity at the time. But we were going to be homesteaders. We'll talk about this in a little bit. And so I really felt this thread of Merton guiding me in a sense. And I had some interesting life on that land, but I have tremendous gratitude for that part of my life, certainly in retrospect.
5 years you were there.
5 years.
What did you do?
So on this land, there was a log cabin that had been handmade. You could still see the axe marks, probably in the 1870s. And we refurbished that. And the rural electric co-op did bring electricity about a mile into the land. We tried to dig a well, but it was a failure because in cave country, you just got into a quicksand and then nothingness. So I went back to Oberlin for my senior year, and my friends Denny and Gua stayed. But after one winter there, they moved into town, and then soon he went to graduate school at Harvard, and they abandoned that life. And so after I graduated, I came back to that land and lived in that log cabin for 5 years. I cooked and heated with wood. I even canned vegetables and fruits with a wood stove. And I was inspired by Merton and meditative traditions. I was doing yoga, but I was doing yoga without a teacher, just with books, which I see was a mistake. I made my life there. Now, my closest neighbors were about 1.5 miles away. A lot of the time I didn't have a car or even a beat up old truck. Only in the last year, with my parents' insistence, that I get a phone line put in there. And it wasn't that I was 100% isolated, but there would be weeks at a time I wouldn't speak to anybody. Now, there were other people from my Oberlin College group of people that back to the lands, and then friends of friends. So at a certain point before I left 5 years into it in 1977, there were about 40 or 50, they called us Hart County hippies, the locals. But what's interesting, this is rural Kentucky. there was never hostility. We were welcome. And part of the reason we were welcome is we would do the work that the farmers' kids wouldn't do, with harvesting hay and harvesting tobacco and cleaning up fence rows and doing, hard manual labor, which I was never prepared to do. But that's a whole nother story, but I learned. But I think the crowning thing of what happened to me in those years was the US Department of Agriculture had a program for landowners to improve their forest, timber stand improvement, it was called. It was a federal program where a forestry agent came out, and just the way you prune in a garden or where you pull out too many plants, if you plant too many lettuces together, none of them are going to grow well. The same thing in a forest. So he marked some of the smaller trees that he felt were crowding out the growth of a dominant tree. And then my work, especially in the cold months, was to go out, hike out into the woods with a chainsaw and clear the forest. And it was wonderful work. A big mistake I made is I didn't wear hearing blocks. And so it's caused me hearing problems at this time in my life. But at the time, I just loved the sound of the chainsaw, and then to see what happened to the forest as the years went by, because even though I left in '77 to study acupuncture in Boston, I would visit regularly. My parents were in Cincinnati. I would go visit them and always go down to Kentucky. And I really could see the work. Now, what's interesting is to work in the forest, or I planted fruit trees too, you really have to change your perception of time, because gratification doesn't happen in a year. It doesn't happen in 5 years. It happens over a longer sequence of time. And as far as perception and acculturation go, how we view time is one of the biggest cultural determinants of how we shape reality. And so working in the forest and being around trees and counting the rings within a tree really changes perception of time. It was very meaningful work. And I was poor as a church mouse at that time. I was able to make a few dollars to help. I think my best year there, I brought in maybe $1,400. But I lived on nothing, and somehow it all worked out.
Did you have any unusual experiences being that close to nature? Absolutely.
I felt connected, but I also felt at the mercy of the verities of weather. And it took me back to some of my religious studies to see how much climate and environment shape consciousness too. One thing happened, which only in retrospect is, and it's just very not coincidental, just subjective. Let's say the experience wasn't subjective, but the linkage I'm going to make is totally subjective. One day I was sitting on the front porch during a mammoth thunder shower, lightning, thunder, torrential rain. And even though when the old cabin was wired, it was grounded. It was done professionally. It was grounded. But I was sitting on the front porch watching the storm and listening to the lightning and the thunder, watching the lightning, listening to the thunder, getting my senses confused. And at one moment, there was a simultaneous thunderclap. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a bright flash, and I was sitting about 6 feet from an electric outlet on the front porch. And out of that outlet, a jolt of energy came and took my body and shook me up like a gin and tonic, and then let me down. I didn't lose consciousness or anything like that, but I wasn't technically hit by lightning, but I was hit. I mean, I did have a radio and a stereo in the cabin. They were blown up. The refrigerator was blown. They weren't on fire, but they never worked again. And I was all alone. There was no one to report it to. This is the most public I've ever been about this experience. But it was in that same cabin that I guess about a year and a half later that I woke up one day from a dream, and all I wanted to do was study acupuncture. And
it just came overnight.
Just out of like a lightning bolt, Sandie. It was like a lightning bolt. I had now looking back, I can see I wanted to be a doctor. I was totally enamored with Taoist and spiritual thought of the East and Buddhist thought. I could see how those threads came together ultimately. But the reason I woke up that day and I don't remember the dream, but I had a challenge. Thinking of perception of time, there were no schools of acupuncture and Chinese medicine in America. This is 1975. There was no internet. I mean, I had no clue about what am I going to do with this interest. The idea of going to Asia it wasn't even a dream. I couldn't even imagine it. If I got off the farm, it was a big trip for me in some ways at that time. What happened then in the winter of 76, 77, my parents decided to move from the house they raised my brothers and myself into a much smaller single level house. And they asked if I would come up and help move some of their more delicate things. And I had a friend with a pickup truck he had actually lived in Kentucky for a while and then moved back to Cincinnati. And so, certainly I'll come. It was the winter, I could have a warm bath and have food cooked for me. So I went up and we stopped at what was the only vegetarian restaurant at the time in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was near the campus of the university there. And we were waiting for our undercooked soy burger to arrive. Soy burgers were pretty hard to eat and digest in those days, but I was a vegetarian at that point. And the Michio Kushi's East-West Foundation, the Macrobiotic Foundation, had a tabloid newspaper at that time about food and culture, Asian culture. And while we're waiting for our soy burgers, I'm just leafing through the paper, and all of a sudden I see an ad announcing America's first state-approved school of acupuncture and Chinese medicine. And boom, the light bulbs went off, and I knew the next step of my destiny was right there in front of me. So I went back and I wrote a letter. I didn't have a phone still, and started corresponding with the school. And then within that fall, I was in Boston. That was a transition. I actually flew to Boston, and talking about a person being out of sorts or not being acclimated, I was lost. But from the first moment I started studying Chinese medicine, I was at home. It just made sense to me, and it transformed my life, and it's given me my life and my career. I'm 40 plus years into practicing and still practicing and still loving it, still being fascinated. People are endlessly fascinating, and that's, I do clinical work. I'm not teaching as much as I used to, but that's that story.
So a question about that experience on the porch there. Did you notice afterwards any changes in you, sensory system, physical, in any way?
Not that I can recall. Not that I could really recall. Again, I was doing yoga a few hours a day and meditating, and I would get up in the middle of the night and read, and but I don't really remember anything in particular. I did hurt my back quite badly, but I think that was before then. But nothing that would be really that I could really say connected. Maybe that's when I started going bald.
We're going to move on to the book. I'll say book that's number 7 on your list, which is the one that's sounds a little bit out of left field, but obviously following on from your time in Kentucky, it maybe isn't quite so surprising after all. And that is the Whole Earth Catalogue.
Yes.
As the first time we've had a non-book publication on the book list. So tell us what it was that made you put this one on your list.
Well, actually, there is a story that goes through the Whole Earth Catalog, a sequential story. So it's I put that on there because this was literally a guidebook for potential back to the earth, homesteading, college educated, totally unschooled and living in the woods or gardening book. It was a review of sort of every like tool and idea and structure. The Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome I was introduced to through there. Tools. I ground all my wheat and corn with a little hand grinder I found in there. It was an amazing reference. But in addition, this was at the first time that pictures were taken, not so much in the catalog, but the cover of it, of Earth from off Earth. And you saw this magnificent orb in interstellar space that was our home. And so even though it was a highly practical and certainly not literary per se, it was spiritual for me, because it is a whole Earth. I'm part of it. I want to live on that Earth. I want to live softly on that Earth. I want to protect that Earth. And this is where the first ideas of environmentalism really were embedded in me, connectivity, practicality. One thing I had learned in my academic and personal studies about spiritual, especially from the Zen point of view, is the famous phrase, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water, after life. Now, I'm not saying I'm enlightened by any means, but I chopped wood and I carried water. I literally carried water, and I chopped wood to heat and cook. And I still feel that in the practical day-to-day aspect of life is the opportunity for awareness, connectivity, and spiritual development. And the Whole Earth Catalog, again, in the cohort that I was part of, we would just look at it together. It was a sharing, we'd look at a product and we go, wow, that's so interesting. It's sort of like Yelp reviews and Google, all at once.
Yeah.
It was just so practical and so important. And again, this was a very personal process for me. I wasn't trying to sell books or, get interest in books. And I just felt that it was a crucial part of the spiritual part for me of grounding. Usually we think of the energy of spirituality as upward, but for me, a lot of that spiritual energy is rootedness and groundedness. And the Whole Earth Catalog really was a Bible of that for me in many ways. Another part, there was a company called Rodale Press that had the Encyclopedia of Gardening. I mean, I bought seeds and I didn't know what to do with them. I mean, I was a babe in the woods. I mean, I didn't take a course in gardening. And so it was practical and grounding and very, very, very helpful.
Yeah, I can understand that. So number 8, The Web That Has No Weaver, Understanding Chinese Medicine, Ted Kapchuk.
Yeah. Has that appeared on anybody else's list that you've seen?
No, it has not.
Yeah. Well, again, this comes back to my practicality. The background of this is, and this is a major book in Chinese medicine. It's not a major textbook or anything at this point, but when this book appeared, it created a literature that you could share with parents, we could share with patients, with lay people, anyone who had any interest, because it's so highly readable. And it was academic, especially before so much literature was available now. I mean, when I started acupuncture school in 1977, there was a couple of books by Englishmen. There was Felix Mann had a book, and J.R. Worsley had a book. But there was my teacher, Dr. Tinyao So, the headmaster, it was his authority that allowed the school to become state approved. He was a noted teacher in Asia who was brought to America. He had a handbook that he had written that was just for his students, and that was our learning: diagnosis, treatment, theory, and then really practical point usages. And so we're in class that fall of 1977, and there's all of a sudden buzz around the school. An American, Ted Kapchuk, had come back from, I think, 4 years in Asia, studying Chinese medicine more at the root in a more traditional way than Dr. So had a family tradition. Ted Kapchuk presented more what was being taught in China at that time, and he was going to be teaching his first class ever at the New England School that fall, and it was an extra fee, but it was certainly modest. And so I signed up for it. Little did I know I was going to have an inspirational teacher and a man who's become a lifelong friend. And this book, again, it's where something that seems from an outside maybe to be esoteric or highly technical, he makes it so enjoyable and so readable. And then as a teacher, it became such a good resource for me to teach from and to share with students. And I had that direct bond to Ted. One thing about this book, and there's a second edition now, if you're an academic or a researcher and a skeptic, there are so many footnotes that bring in research studies and other things that correlate to the basic work of the writing. Traditional Chinese medicine, acupuncture, herbs, it's a very effective medical modality. Just like with my spirituality, I'm not going to throw away where I came from. So I embrace science. And as we'll talk about biology, belief later, science is a miracle. And the way it rationally helps us understand so many mysteries is to be alive during so much of this is just extraordinary, and to see what's happened throughout Western culture too. But Chinese medicine is very effective, and it's what people say, well, does it cure cancer? Well, no. But it'll help us stay well. Now, it definitely will help relieve and cure some things, or help eliminate symptoms of many things, and regulate the body, or lower blood pressure, help with sleep, facilitate digestion, help with fertility. I mean, the impact of it, I don't want to minimize it all, but the integrative medicine we see happening now is just so valuable, because we say in Chinese medicine, it's a yin-yang thing, that there's the pathogenic factor and the anti-pathogenic factor. Western medicine has taken the pathogenic factor, the disease agents, and striven to understand them as well as they can, and then in some way eliminate them, destroy them, modify them, genetically modify them. East Asian medicine has always focused primarily on the anti-pathogenic factor, how we stay well. And it does a very, very good job of that, and it continues to do a very good job of that. And it has tremendous benefit for society if more people would embrace the teachings. And it's not just that. It's interesting, I'm a licensed acupuncturist. I've been so for many years. I'm so grateful that I am. But that's just, it's the name of a technique. If anything, I'd prefer to be a doctor of traditional East Asian medicine, for instance, because especially my own work embraces more than just Chinese.
Yeah.
But we don't call a surgeon a scalpel wielder, or a dentist a tooth driller. We don't identify their professional status by a technique. But acupuncture became it has pizzazz. We put needles in the body and there's no blood and people feel better, so we're called licensed acupuncturists. And interestingly enough, acupuncture within the culture of Chinese medicine, it's not a standalone therapy. They always talked about acumoxotherapy, which is a thermal or a heating technique. So if anything, I'd be a licensed acumoxotherapist if they wanted to be technical. But I'm grateful to be this. But it's a much broader medicine, and it's not just a medicine; it's a way of living. It's following the Tao, basically.
So book number 9 is, I would hazard a guess and say it's the one that appears most often on people's lists, and that is The Power of Now, a guide to spiritual enlightenment.
Yeah. Eckhart Tolle, he really synthesized and brought to a very manageable and easily digestible and embraced and embodied understanding that our mind is a magnificent gift, but it's also a double-edged sword. And we're always worrying about the future and ruminating about the past. And the only place we really are is in the now. And I just think he explained it beautifully, and just succinctly, and presented it in a non-threatening way. He didn't make it wrong for having monkey minds, but he recognized that was what it was. Something I wrote in my essay here was, I felt for myself and maybe people in my generation that there was a bridge between Ram Dass's landmark book, Be Here Now, and The Power of Now. Because when Ram Dass's book, Be Here Now, came out, it set off a fire of awareness. And I think that that was much more of his personal journey. And coincidentally, I got to meet Ram Dass and massage his feet one day in Boston when I was in school there, and he was so articulate, so funny, so clever. He had a huge aura. I remember when I took his feet in my hands, I felt like a little lightning bolt happened. It was a powerful moment. And so I felt that bridge. And so to be here now, you had to understand the power of now. And so I felt so grateful that Eckhart Tolle had written this book. It became very popular. People who had never thought about observing their own mind started to observe their own mind. And I just am grateful for that, because I think that the more we become aware of how we're projecting our own stuff out into the world, the less we're going to do that. And the more we can just see that everybody's here trying to get by, trying to struggle, hopefully trying to do good. And that only comes, I believe, if we can quiet our own mind. The only way to access our intuition, except for in dreams, is to shut up. Yeah. And I found that very helpful in my healing work. I'm somewhat known as an intuitive healer. And I think it all just comes, I get quiet, especially because we do traditional pulse taking. I do traditional pulse taking. And whenever I take someone's pulse, they might be ta 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 ta, and I reach for their pulse, whoop, because they want me to connect. Yeah. And when I do that connect and I feel the pulse, something will come to me. And I've learned to not frame it of like, do you have a problem with your liver? I'll say, are you having any kind of anger issues or digestive issues? Are you and so that ability to be in the moment serves me well, and I think can serve everybody quite well.
Absolutely. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, and I really do want to leave a little bit of time to talk about Metta Mindfulness music. So our 10th book is The Biology of Belief, Unleashing the Power of Consciousness, Matter and Miracles by Bruce Lipton. I don't know many people who haven't read this book, but I mean, it was a game changer for me when I first read it. And tell us how it impacted you.
This was a place I felt where I was reading a Western scientist, an extraordinary Western scientist who writes beautifully, who changed my operating system, because what we find out that is our genetic code is not determinate. That every cell has, except for our red blood cells that don't have DNA, our cells have all the same DNA, but they express so differently. So, and then he shows that it's actually the cell wall and the little filaments on the cell wall, and this comes back to our music discussion in a way, it will, that are receiving information. So the cell wall is actually the cell brain. It's the brain, and it's what mediates between the cell and the cellular environment, so that the genes can express. And if that intercellular environment becomes toxic, then that cell wall is going to introduce toxicity into the DNA, and the DNA is going to start to express in an aberrant way. And when that becomes an aberrant expression, that's the root of cancer. Yeah. And so this really opened up this whole realm of a scientific recognition of how much power, influence we can actually have on consciousness and our physical health. And like you were saying, it's a game changer, because now we have responsibility. And even before I read that book and my studies, one of my study trips in Asia, I had a Japanese sensei who I studied his Shiatsu form with, which is one of the books I've written. And he was all about the lymph system. And the more I explored the lymph system, that's our sewage system of our body. It's also where our immunity happens. And so keeping the lymph system moving and fluid and as clean as possible is what will allow the biology of belief to manifest in a healthy way. Lipton goes on to talk about how much our thoughts help shape that. And we've seen research that shows the power of thought. And projecting of thought. So it was just a wonderful book. And I watched some of his videos and lectures, and am continually inspired by his work. May he live long. He's not a young man anymore. Another small synergy coincidence is he's good friend. He spends half the year in New Zealand, and my best friend, the naturopathic doctor, has become one of Bruce's best friends in New Zealand. So he's always relaying messages and telling me what Bruce is up to, and it's good to feel that sort of the personal connection to someone who's been quite influential and
Yes.
and hopefully can continue to be.
Amazingly so.
Amazing.
Okay, so that's the 10 books. I do want to talk about Metta Mindfulness music. You met Yuval Ron when you were both teaching at Esalen. Long story short, you created a company together, and you are now using, ancient wisdom, bringing together all your knowledge of Eastern medicine, and creating the most amazing pieces of healing music. So just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I had begun to use sound to facilitate my own meditative practice before I met Yuval. We met in 2011. For about 10 years before that, I had been using, especially binaural beats, which is a whole nother story, to facilitate my meditation. I felt stuck, and I don't have a guru, and that's just what it is, and my heart is open and my mind is open to that. So I was using sound, and it was very helpful. But if you listen to binaural beats enough, it becomes tedious, especially the way it's been done a lot. It's either just like a tapping beat it's auditorily aware, you're aware of it, or it's underneath synthesized music. And it had become somewhat of a nuisance to me. And then thankfully, coincidentally, spiritually, synergistically, teaching it, I was teaching traditional Thai medical massage, which is a meditative style of therapeutic body healing work, which came out of the Buddhist monasteries. That's another story I'd love to share sometime with you. And Yuval was there teaching a course with a noted neuroscientist, Mark Waldman. He's published in the field, a class on sound and neuroscience. And Yuval and I met. And without any predetermined thought or any plan or anything, I casually said to him, is it possible to bring let me go back. He's a Hollywood composer. This Esalen gig was a secondary thing it was a avocation, not a vocation. I said, is it possible to bring a high level of musicality to meditative music? And he said, yeah, why not? But he had he didn't have a producer. He didn't have someone behind him funding the projects and giving him ideas. And so we formed a partnership, which we call Metta, which comes from Buddha. It means loving kindness and mindfulness. And we actually, when we started, we thought it might be just a one-off because I was busy with what I do. He was busy with what he does. Our first project was to use the 6 healing sounds of Qigong from the Chinese medicine. And part of our mission from when we discussed things from the beginning was to use ancient wisdom traditions with modern neuroscience with a high level of musicality. And we wanted acoustic musicians because the vibratory effect on the whole body of acoustic musicians is much different. Even though synthesized music sounds the same, if you look at it on an oscilloscope, it's definitely a different vibrational field. And it turns out in Chinese medicine, first of all, the character for medicine in the Chinese language, it combines the 2 characters, one for music and one for herbs. So music is deeply embedded in Chinese medicine. Our oldest text, the Yellow Emperor's Classic from about 236 BC, has references where each of the 5 elements is given one of the tonics. So we composed based on that. So we did this album. We layer it. We have subliminal affirmations. We have droning, and then the main theme is playing, and it's deep and it's rich and it's effective, and people loved it. And so we thought, I was game for more. And Yuval, he's very busy, but he thought we'd go for it. Then we looked at the doshas of Ayurvedic. A lot of people had done music based on the chakras, but we didn't see any dosha music at that time. So he composed. Our work is meant to evoke and harmonize the 3 doshas of Ayurvedic. We recorded a sitar player in India and Mumbai this is where technology comes in, where people can just go to a high-level studio in their home city, and then Yuval runs this session through Skype, and we have a Bansuri flute player. He's Indian, but he was in LA, and Jayutal chants the Om. It turns out you can chant Om in certain ways to invoke the doshas. And so that came up. Now that one got a Grammy nomination.
Yeah.
And so we just keep going. And so once we opened that door, we did the 4 divine states of mind from Buddhism. That we did in mantra form, which is another way of using sound for meditation, the repetition of mantra. And we did go back and do a chakra project, because we met a meditation yogi, a psychic teacher from England who lived in LA, who wanted to do that and didn't have anyone to help produce it and actually create the whole project, which was the music, and then she wrote original. And so we're continuing. So currently in the lab, we have a project based on the Tree of Life and the Kabbalah from the Jewish tradition. And we have more, which I'm happy to share with you in the future. But
and you and I have done many interviews now on what is going on, where we actually play some of the music and get a chance to hear it. Now, I think on the website, people can sample the music, can't they?
Samples, and we're on YouTube and Spotify. Yeah. So if you don't find us under Metta Mindfulness Music, search under the name Yuval, Y-U-V-A-L, Ron, R-O-N. We have a huge presence on Insight Timer, which is a marvelous meditation app. Yeah. And there we've created programs, 10-day programs that they want on their site. And one of our programs has over 7,000 people that have done it. I don't know if they've all done 10 days, but we get tremendous exposure. And as the producer, I get the feedback about our music, and it puts smiles on my face. It is so heartwarming that our music is not just impacting people, but people all over the world. I mean, I get messages from Uzbekistan and Saudi Arabia and South America and Russia, and it's just...
Well, it's the universal language, isn't it?
Music is the universal language. Yeah. And as you know, Yuval is extraordinarily talented, and he has access, and people love to work with him, high-level musicians. Yeah. And one of your authors, Deva Premal, is one of our singers.
Yes.
And she's marvelous.
Yeah. She is indeed. Well, we're out of time now, Richard. We're on a tight schedule tonight, unfortunately, because I'd love to talk longer. Metta Mindfulness Music, that's 2 T's, .com. Do go and check it out. Just before we close, what are you reading now?
I'm reading more stuff about the brain. I'm reading a book called Buddha's Brain by, I forget, it's Jim Hansen, I think is his name. And it's stuff from India about the sound healing. But I'm also reading a Korean novel, Panchamama. It's obviously in translation. So the other thing I read a lot is the New Yorker magazine. The writing in there is so extraordinary, and how they put it out every week, I don't know. And I love the variety of articles, things I never even thought about. But you'll find me reading every day.
Richard Gold, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you and hear about your 10 best list.
Thank you so much, Sandie. Really appreciate it. You be well.
Yeah, take care, Richard. Thank you at home for joining us. For more information about the No BS Spiritual Book Club, go over to sedgbeer.com, or just type in the No BS Spiritual Book Club.com and you'll find us. We'll be back again at the same time next week with another edition of Face to Face with, and I'll see you then.